A Very Simple Secret. My parents, their mission to change the world, and me, Judi Conner's parents, were on a mission to remake the world. These were the Cold War years of the 50s and 60s following a catastrophic world war and the breaking up of colonial empires. They joined many others in giving up conventional careers and family life to work for the moral rearmament, an extensive global movement, the life goal to build a hate-free, fear-free, greed-free world. What happened next and growing up in that world is the subject of the book, A Very Simple Secret. I'd like to say that joining me live on the line from somewhere in the UK, I believe, is Judi Conner. Judi, good morning to you.
Good morning from very rainy, stormy east in the, what's it called, Beast of the East, I heard on your headlines, in Norfolk. We're in rainy Norfolk.
Well, hang on in there, as the saying goes. Now, for those who don't know, just explain a little bit about what the MRA, the moral rearmament, is it Buccanism? Is that another way from it as well? That was another new name for it.
It was controversial, and opponents called them Bookmanites because the founder was called Frank Bookman. But yes, MRA, what a mouthful, moral rearmament, was a global peace movement in the 40s, 50s, 60s. And my parents devoted their lives to it, along with hundreds and thousands of others. It was very well known at the time, unlike now.
You can't fault the sort of the beginning point of it, can you? Because obviously we've been through the horrors of the Second World War. You're in the midst of the Cold War, mutually assured destruction, and a lot of old values and a lot of old sort of ways of living were to be reevaluated. And those in the MRA thought that they had the idea. What were the sort of center points of the MRA's thinking and theology?
Yes, well, there was kind of a personal and a global aspect to it. I mean, the global side was this huge ambition to actually change the world. And that needs to be understood in the context of the time. It was a very idealistic age. People were being drawn to communism, to fascism. There was a big war of ideas going on, which we have now, but maybe we don't talk about it quite so much. But at the heart of it was the idea that personal change in people leads to lasting social change and a good society. And the founder that we talked about, Frank Bookman, was originally a Lutheran minister in America. But he felt that people of religion were not tackling the world's problems. And they needed people of goodwill, not just religion, maybe who have good strong social conscience or whatever. Maybe they should be tackling world affairs in the same way that communism and fascism had solutions to things. Maybe there was a third way. And so that was his idea. But he called people to make quite a sort of what seems now like quite a monastic sort of commitment to live by absolute moral standards, honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. I mean, wow, it's not how we talk now. And to follow a higher authority, make God if you believe in God, but whatever culture you come from, maybe it's conscience, maybe, if you don't, you're not a person of faith. So there were these two aspects. You change yourself and you go out and change society. But it demanded their all. My parents gave up salary, home, family life, and that brings us back to the book. As a child, I realized I wasn't quite so comfortable with it, but I didn't realize that at the time.
But if you think about it, I mean, the internet and social media is full of sort of memes and whatever saying one person can make a difference, and it's, change yourself and you can change the world. So that sort of philosophy kind of still holds true, and you can see the attraction, can't you, by saying, well, you don't have to live by these tropes of communism or fascism or socialism or ism. But if you start, before you can change the world, you have to change yourself, as all the self-help books gathering dust in the corner of my library tend to tell me.
That's right, and I'm wrong to say we don't have idealists now at all. It's just that maybe that what MRA was presenting then was a very practical way to start the revolution with yourself. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a lot of talk of ideas, but you don't see. I mean, what was, I think, very special about this was it was a huge mobilization of people who took it very seriously. And I think they took it seriously because they had such a sense of urgency. We've got similar, they had terrible problems to face. This idea started in the 30s. They'd had the Great Depression. There was the growth of communism in Russia and fascism in Italy and Germany and all this stuff going on. I mean, we have different problems now, but we also feel this sense of impending doom and indeed, a sense of impending global war, possibly even with the Middle East and Ukraine. But they had this sense of urgency, and you talk about memes and the modern context. I think doing research for this book, I found my parents talked in the same language as the Greens. Many, people from Extinction Rebellion talk about saving the planet. If we don't act now, we won't have a planet to save. And that is how the MRA people felt back in the 40s, 50s, 60s. We must act now or we will be overtaken by totalitarianism, extremists. We won't have a free society. That was the ultimate game, really.
So how old were you when your parents decided that they were going to follow their own spiritual code and their moral code and they were compelled to do this?
Well, they both took it up before they'd even met each other.
Oh, right. Okay.
They both joined up when my father was a Cambridge student at university. My mother was a language student when they met it. So they came at a younger stage. Nothing was further from their mind than marriage and family life. And that kind of evolved. They met, they fell in love. After a long absence in the war, they married and two children came along. It wasn't just me, it was my brother. And that whole generation, I think they were taken by surprise because all these full-time workers with MRA were traveling the world. They organized conferences, they had musical shows, they had books, they brought people together. They did twin-track diplomacy behind the scenes to do conflict resolution. All these important things, but they didn't know what to do with the kids. So there was a boarding school that I talk about. I spent a couple of years in Switzerland attached to one of their conference centers.
Right.
I spent 2 years there, but I actually spent, my first long absence from my parents, I was 4 and I spent 1 year living with a family. They were friends, but I was kind of adopted there were 7 children in that family and I was the 8th. And, I went to school with the youngest daughter who was my age. And I had a very happy year, actually, because I didn't know what was going on and I didn't know what was normal. And it was only gradually when I was 6 years old at school, I started to realize that living at that stage in a communal posh commune in Mayfair in London, which was the MRA centre in London, I just suddenly realized this isn't normal. And I started to realize at that very early age that I was living in 2 worlds, a slightly cultish world and the world that, most people would associate.
That was going to be my next thing. And you said slightly cultish. There are little fringes of culty behavior when you say posh commune, which I think that would be a great name for a band, by the way. But if you think of, live on stage, posh commune, but if you think of what cults per se do and say, you have to divorce yourself. But they tend to divorce themselves from the real world. A lot of them, you can think of the more infamous cults, whereas the MRA was very active. You say it was music, it was shows, it was theatre, it was getting out amongst people. It wasn't saying we're going to shut the outside world. We're going to live separate from the outside world and only we know the secret. MRA was very, very, the doctrine was to get out there and try and get more people to consider their moral standpoints.
Well, it was in theory, and it was really out there alongside major statespeople. It helped it was a long story, but the foundation of the European unity after the Second World War, because the first German leader, Adenauer, and the first French foreign minister after the war, I'm not sure about first, but Robert Schuman were the founders of the European community. And they were very close to Frank Bookman and the MRA work. And it influenced a lot of situations quietly that people don't know an awful lot about. So in a sense, yes, it was out there. But when you get a movement that grows from being a small fellowship, if you like, when Frank Bookman started off, he just had a group of followers who sort of traveled around with him, but it grew and it grew. So there were hundreds and thousands, and there were 2 huge conference centers, one in America, one Switzerland, centers all over the world. You get a structure, you get, and all this thing about, they used to say, well, we don't have a structure, we don't have proper, well, Frank Bookman's a bit of a leader, but it's very, very, we seek the higher authority for direction, and we don't need a structure and all of that. But in fact, you do. They're developed naturally as human, a hierarchy, and there were controls, and there were unwritten rules. They said we don't have rules, but there were. I mean, as a child, I observed we didn't smoke or drink or what other types of things. I mean, it was a fairly strict monastic calling for the primers, anyway.
And you describe yourself almost as living a double life. So there was your life within the MRA, and then there was life in the normal world. Because you said you were you dreaded people asking what your father did.
Yes, that's what really the secret of the book. A very simple secret. It became, although that's also a song title that you read about in the book, but it became a closely guarded secret, because I went to boarding school. Boarding school was very tough in those days. It wasn't Hogwarts, the idyllic fun and games. Well, there was a bit of that, but it was very miserable. If you could imagine me as an 8-year-old being at prep school in Devon and not seeing my parents for 2 years because they went to Brazil, and no phone contact. I never heard their voice for all the time that they were away. It affects you. And I think there's stuff in this book for anyone who went to boarding school, which was a large number of people of my generation, for all sorts of reasons. In those days, parents were traveling and this, that, and the other. But, it was the end of the colonial age, and there were still people who had those types of jobs around the world and in the army and all that. And so boarding school was tough. And I quickly figured out that to survive, I needed a different persona. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to be liked. And I didn't think I would be accepted if I spoke about the MRA, and I couldn't. It was complicated. You can tell from what I'm saying. It's not an easy thing to say in one sentence. And I found that and I represent. There are a lot of us growing up. I've already, even the book's only just out, and I have had so many messages from other children brought up this way.
That's the thing, though, isn't it? Because and that time, you say it's at the end of the empire, and the 50s and the 60s. A lot of people had jobs in the army. My family were army, our army, and yeah, they were in Germany, and then they were in Cyprus, and the kids were in boarding school, and and you'd see them. It bred a special kind of mentality, doesn't it? If you don't see your parents for a very long time, and now you'd be looking back at it, we look in 2020s, and that's tantamount to child abuse, basically. But we were just told to get on with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it was we felt neglected and abandoned. But I don't think or speak for myself, I didn't know all this at the time. I mean, I didn't analyze. I just felt this does feel fairly normal. These other kids don't have their parents with them either. I mean, the difference for me was I never knew where I was going in the holidays even. So when my parents were in Brazil, I didn't know. I went to different friends. I went to my grandparents a little bit, but they were quite old and I couldn't go there all the time. So it was a very, very, very strange existence, but one that a lot of other people who have never heard of MRA would actually identify with, I think. I mean, there's actually a group called the Boarding School Survivors Association, which is quite big. I went to a day conference there last year and was amazed to see how big it was and how many people have felt damaged by just that education. So I think that separation, it does affect people, and you don't make up the years with your parents. I loved my parents. I was good friends with them in later life, but you don't make up when you're strangers for so long as a child. And
the thing is, the irony of this is it's called the moral rearmament. And yet, perhaps the centerpiece of anybody's morality is their relationships and their relationships with their children and with the world around them. So it's all very well to have the highfalutin ideas that we're going to save the world from the Cold War, and it starts at this pace. But physician, heal thyself.
You've got the dilemma in a nutshell. I mean, this book is about idealism and versus the cost of idealism. That's in a nutshell, and that's it. I mean, they had such a sense of urgency that they honestly felt they had to be away doing these big campaigns, putting everything into it, and then we would have a life. And I wonder whether they thought they were going to fix things sooner than they did, because obviously It's quite hard to evaluate their work. It is possible, but it's.
You had siblings. You've got brothers and sisters, presumably. I mean, were they at the same boarding school, or were they scattered around other boarding schools? And how do you build a relationship with them? Because you've all been through that shared experience, yet that shared but separate experience.
Very good question. I mean, I had an adored brother. I have an adored brother. He's still here. He was in Hong Kong, but he's 5 years older than me. And we just grew up separately. I mean, probably the first 2 years we were together because my parents were in the UK during that time. But he went off to boarding prep school at 7, so I would have been at 2. And then he went to the same boarding school my father had been at. I think my parents were they were middle class. They'd been through boarding school and that sort of background. So for them, it wasn't. That seemed like security that they were offering us, I think. They thought they were doing all the right things, I think.
Was there a point then when your parents decided to, were they MRA devotees throughout their lifetimes? Or was there a point where they suddenly had a revelation, thought, this is not going to go, we're not going to get the results we want, we're going to step away from this now?
Yeah, surprisingly few of them seem to do that. And somebody's done some research on that, and the figures are quite low for absconders. And my parents certainly stayed with it through their long lives to the 80s and 90s. The nature of their work changed rather. I mean, during the time I'm writing about was my first 12 years of my life because I wanted to research the missing years when I didn't know my parents. But my parents in their last 30 years were devoted to this twin track diplomacy that I talked about. It's when NGOs get behind the scenes in a situation like the Middle East. And my parents worked in the Middle East and I think did a lot of important bridge building work, shall we say. And that was their focus. And they were that much at their happiest doing that work. But they did stay totally devoted, yes. And indeed, I mean, the movement has morphed into, it was rebranded in 2000 into something with I would personally say equally difficult name, Initiatives of Change. Okay. And that's more, it's geared to conflict resolution, building trust and sustainability. It's a modernized sort of theme and it's a modernized outfit. It doesn't depend on volunteers. It's still there. And also, if you've heard Alcoholics Anonymous and 12-Step Program, I don't know if you've come across those at all, but I'm not meaning to ask a personal question there, but they're fairly well known, and there are direct offshoots of the work of Frank Bookman came up with those principles in the first place, that you turn your own life around and then you take it out to other people.
Interesting. What was the spark then led to this book?
Well, I felt it was high time that I faced up, having hidden a lot of this and not wanted to talk about my childhood very much. I felt it was high time that I revisited it, and it's actually been very therapeutic to do that. But then I couldn't do that without getting the context, and I wanted to know, where were my parents during those missing years? Up to 12 years old, where were they? What were they doing? So I've researched it very meticulously, and I've interwoven the two stories. So there's the confused child story and the idealistic parent story. And I found it so fascinating. I also thought it's a very fascinating time of history because everything was changing, a whole new world order coming in, everything was changing. And I think it's fascinating history, even if you've never heard of MRA. I just felt this needs to be talked about. And a lot of people associated with MRA don't talk about it very much. I'm not quite sure why, but I think there's a bit of a taboo around the name. And
well, there is, because I'm that worst sort of person. I'm an armchair historian, and I know my isms, my fascism, my Nazism, and my alcoholism, but I don't know anything about. This was a new one to me, and the 20s and the 30s are full of these idealistic movements about having a brave new world and Spanish Civil War. I'm sitting in a studio in southern Spain, so we know a bit about that, you see, about people going off and fighting and dying for their ideals, which we don't have today to a certain extent. So it is a fascinating period of history.
Really is. And that's an example I give when my father was doing his soul searching as a student. He was very interested in world affairs. He originally wanted to go and work in the Foreign Office as a career. He was assuming that's probably what he'd do. But he looked around him and saw all these burgeoning groups. I mean, he was at Cambridge at the same time as the Cambridge spies, incidentally, or just after, who were recruited as communists, when they were around Trinity College.
Yeah.
And that was rather extreme. I'm not saying that all the idealists went to such extremes as to betray the country for their ideals, but actually that's how seriously people then felt more empowered, I think, than today, and they felt they could make more of a difference. We talk about making a difference, but in those days, young people kind of felt they could impact the way history was going, and there's plenty of evidence that's what people thought, whether they took up communism or went off to Spain, as you say. I mean, it seems astonishing to think of students giving their lives as readily as those volunteers did to go and fight fascism in Spain. Extraordinary.
What do you hope that people will take from A Very Simple Secret?
Well, funnily enough, I deliberately decided not to argue a case, and reach a conclusion about it and analyze the work of MRA. So, I haven't got a point that I want people to learn or accept from in that sense. What I wanted to do was get inside the movement because people haven't. I've never seen much written about it unless it's promotional or attacking fiercely. And there's a lot of both those. I want to just tell a story, human story from inside the movement. And I think, as I said, a lot of people who aren't even interested in MRA as such, but who are interested in ideas or neglected children who were at boarding school or any other type of neglect, I think they'll take some support from the idea that, that was then and you can work through it. And it's not the... I think also just revisiting a fascinating bit of time in history is valid enough too.
The book is called A Very Simple Secret. My Parents, Their Mission to Change the World, and Me. It's by Judi Conner, who we're speaking to today. Judi, if people want to find you online, is there a website? Do you do the social media thing? Can people find you online?
Yes, please do. Website is judiconner.co.uk. And just remember, Judy's with an I and Conner with an E. Always have to say that. Judi Conner.
And the book is also available. You can order it via our own virtual bookstore. The book is called A Very Simple Secret. It's by Judi with an I, Conner with an E. Judi, it's been fascinating to speak to you today. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you, Giles. It's been great.